Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Harper, and I'm the Dean and Director of Melbourne Business School. I would like to send a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us this morning from wherever you happen to be. Those of you in the United States, for example, or other time zones around the world, welcome to Melbourne. It's just past 9:30 in the morning here on Thursday the 11th. Well, it's in the spirit of reconciliation with Australia's First Peoples that Melbourne Business School acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which the school's buildings stand here in Melbourne. We acknowledge traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I personally acknowledge and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who have joined us for today's lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge some very important guests who are joining us online. First, of course, Mr. Charles Goode, AC, after whom our oration is named. Welcome, Charles. As well as the university's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Duncan Maskell, Professor Paul Kaufman, the Co-Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics with me here at the university, several members of our school board, including our chairman, Ross Barker. I can also see that we're joined by several of the school's donors and partners. It's just wonderful to have you all with us for this very important occasion. Thank you again for joining us. Well, before we commence the lecture, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping matters. So following the presentation, we'll have we've scheduled a time for Q&A, and during which our speaker will answer questions from the audience. We invite you to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function that most of you, I'm sure, would be familiar with on the screen. So you type your question in there, and then you can also see, of course, through the Q&A function what other people have asked. And if you think that you'd like to have our speaker answer that question, possibly in preference to yours, or at the very least, to see it answered, then you can upvote that by pressing on the little thumbs up. Now, while we expect we can spend a lot of time dealing with the subject matter that our speaker is addressing today, we do aim to finish promptly at 10:30, possibly 10:35, given we've had a late start, but it will be no later than 10:35. Well, again, it's a delight to welcome you all this morning to the Charles Goode Oration. The Charles Goode Oration was established by the school in 2010 to honour one of our founding donor members and honorary fellows, Mr. Charles Goode, AC. Charles would be very well known to an Australian audience, at the very least, as an accomplished businessman, having served as chairman of the ANZ Bank, Woodside Petroleum for many years, and as the director of Singapore Airlines. Currently, Mr. Goode is chairman emeritus of Flagstaff Partners and chairman of the Ian Potter Foundation. In 2001, Charles was invested as a companion in the Order of Australia for his services to the finance industry and his directorship of charitable and health-related organisations. Well, our guest speaker, ladies and gentlemen, this morning is Daron Acemoglu, who is an institute professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Daron is one of the world's most respected economists, as well as the author of several books, including Why Nations Fail and Redesigning AI. Daron's work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, labour economics, economic growth and development, technological change, inequality, and networks. He is an elected fellow of several prestigious organisations, including the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the British Academy of Sciences, the European Economic Association, and the Society of Labour Economists, as well as being a member of the Group of 30. Among his many impressive achievements, Daron has received the inaugural T.W. Schultz Prize from the University of Chicago, the inaugural Sherwin-Rosen Award for outstanding contributions to labour economics, the Global Economy Prize, and most recently, the CME Mathematical and Statistical Research Institute Prize. He also holds honorary doctorates from the University of Utrecht, the University of Athens, and the London Business School. Well, with a record like that, you will not be surprised to hear me say that we are absolutely honoured to have Daron Acemoglu here today to deliver the 2021 Charles Goode Oration at Melbourne Business School. Daron, welcome again. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us this morning, and we now very much look forward to your remarks. I'll return afterwards to lead our Q&A. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Ian, and apologies to everybody for keeping you waited. It was a combination of children's health issues plus incredible traffic adversity at this hour. Perhaps should be incredible. But despite that delay and stressful ride, I am delighted to be here with you, and I would like to talk about building a fair world after COVID-19, and I'm going to share my screen to do that. I hope you can see my screen now. Can everybody see the screen?
We can. Yes. Thank you, Daron.
Perfect. Excellent. All right. So it's a great honor to be joining you, albeit remotely, for the Charles Goode Oration. And the topic of this lecture is hopefully quite timely. There are a number of very major challenges facing humanity today. So much so that I think you can call them existential challenges, at least for the way of life that has developed over the last 60 or so years in most of the Western world. There is a huge increase in inequality in many parts of the world. There is very rapid climate change, which I don't need to tell people about, given that we are in the week of COP26, and collapse of democracies and dwindling trust in public institutions. All of these, in their own ways, are threatening certain aspects of our comfortable life, both economic and social, that have been very important for our civilization. And I think as economists, we have to think about the roles of markets, firms, and governments. And I think the default position of economists often starts from what became known in the popular press as shareholders' values perspective, articulated by, among others, Milton Friedman, that the job of firms is to look after the profits and the benefits of shareholders, and somehow if the market process works, this is going to generate the right type of welfare, and that will be the best place where we can look for solutions to both economic and social problems, such as the ones that I have highlighted. But today, perhaps most commentators are less happy to take that as a default position. And even the influential Business Roundtable, representing many CEOs, has been calling for corporations to serve all of their stakeholders and move away from shareholder values. Facebook is advertising commitment to new internet regulations. Philip Morris is touting his plans to make smoking history. ExxonMobil has recently announced a 5-year climate plan to reduce greenhouse gases. So perhaps we are moving away from shareholder values, and there's a new era of corporate responsibility that might help us deal with these challenges. Actually, I don't think that's right. I think what we are seeing is symbolic and telling about the underlying problems, but the current proposals don't go far enough. And I think they're not confronting the most important challenges, including inequality and the nature of works and climate. And I'm going to argue that instead of these existing half-hearted attempts, we need to understand the nature of these problems. And when we do, we'll see that they are all about technology, and their solutions will have to feature what I'm going to call redirection of technological change. And hence, we need to have an institutional framework, including about how firms and markets should function, how governments should regulate, that squarely takes on regulation of technology. And to develop that, I'm going to spend some time on each one of these challenges. And let me, without further ado, start with inequality. I'll show you some international data in a second, but let me start from the US, which is the place which I know best in terms of my work in this area. And in this figure, you see something remarkable. I'm plotting the wage bill of the private sector in the United States. That means employment times average wage in the private sector. And on the left, you see that in the 4 decades that follows World War II, you have something remarkable. Very, very rapid and fairly steady growth of wage bill. In fact, so much so that the real wage bill, inflation adjusted, grew at 2.5 percentage points faster than population. So if employment to population ratio is constant, which more or less it was during this period, increased a little bit, workers would enjoy on average more than 2% real growth every year. But look at it in the last 30 years on the right, and you see something completely different. First, a slowdown in wage bill, and then its growth completely flattens out, so much so that it's more or less the same today as it was, relative to population as it was in 2000. This has a number of transformative effects. It is, of course, related to the decline in male participation rates. It is related to the decline in the labor share in national income, but it is also intimately connected to a huge increase in inequality that I have already hinted at. So here are 2 figures that summarize some of those inequality patterns by looking at weekly wages for 10 demographic groups. Men, women, and going all the way from bottom, the dark red for high school dropouts, working people without a high school degree, all the way to the dark blue, which is workers with a postgraduate degree. And what you see in the 60s, and the same is true in the 50s using different data sources, is that all 10 demographic groups are experiencing fairly similar growth rates, above 2% a year in each case, in real terms. So that wage bill growth was indeed translating into very healthy growth of real incomes. But then from 1980 onward, something very different happens. First, you see a huge increase in inequality. These curves are going apart, both for men and women. Even workers, male workers with just a college degree, no postgraduate degree, are experiencing only small gains in their real wages. And of course, putting those 2 together, the bottom, high school graduates, high school dropouts, both among men and women, are experiencing very significant declines in real wages. This is economically costly and socially costly in ways I'm going to comment on in the context of democracy and the dwindling trust in public institutions. Inequality is not just a US phenomenon. US has the dubious distinction of being the most unequal economy according to most measures within the Western sort of rich country club. By Gini, for example, it is above all the others in the OECD 22. And it has one of the largest increases, but Australia has a large increase, New Zealand has a large increase, Sweden, Germany has a large increase. Pretty much every country has an increase in inequality during this time period, from 1980 to the mid-2010s. More telling, and perhaps less well known to everybody in the audience, there are other commonalities across these economies. Even though whether real wages fell at the bottom in the Anglo-Saxon economies and in Germany they did, in the continental Europe they didn't, all of these economies seem to experience a parallel trend in the disappearance of what I'm going to refer to as middle-class jobs. So in this figure, the employment distribution in every country for which there is data, in this data set anyway, this can be extended and has been extended by others to other countries, and the same pattern holds there as well. But you classify jobs into bottom tercile, middle tercile, and high tercile of occupations in terms of skill or wage. So the red here refers to middle class occupations at the middle, blue color, operator, transport workers, retail, sales, and office work. All countries show a decline in the fraction of these jobs. So these middle class jobs are much less common today. They are replaced either higher skill green or lower skill blue types of jobs. And what's distinctive, of course, about these jobs, other than being in the middle and the bedrock of middle class upward mobility in many of these societies, the so-called American dream in the United States, is that they are the types of jobs that could be automated. So in blue-collar jobs were the ones automated by dedicated machinery and industrial robots, and the white-collar middle-class jobs were the ones that were most easy to automate by software and databases in offices. But I want to take a step back here, and I want to argue that before we jump into a discussion of automation, productivity, and so on, which will be part of my talk, it is really imperatively important to distinguish different types of technologies. The discussions of automation are as old as the British Industrial Revolution, and leading economists, including Keynes and Wassily Leontief, had warned about automation leading to job losses and various other bad outcomes for labor. But the economics profession on the whole, has dismissed these concerns even when they came from a luminary like Keynes, arguing that technology, because it increases productivity, will ultimately help labor increase labor demand. But I think now in hindsight, that was the wrong perspective and Keynes was right. But the reason why it was the wrong perspective bears some explanation. And at the heart of it is that we shouldn't think of technology as a monolith that always does the same thing, increases productivity, and therefore technological progress should have the same effect. There are different types of technologies, and they will have different effects on labor. In particular, we should distinguish technologies such as automation that cause displacement, meaning replaces workers in tasks that they used to perform. And particularly those are going to be technologies that automate, such as robots, office software, and technologies that enable offshoring of jobs to other countries. And technologies that my co-author on this series of papers, Pasquale Restrepo, and I call reinstate labor by, for example, creating new tasks or new capabilities for workers. There are various ways of measuring these technologies at the aggregate. And here, what I do on the left is I look at the 1947-1987 period, during which you saw wage bill growth was very healthy and steady. And we estimate what's the contribution to labor demand, and in particular labor share, of displacement created by automation, and what's the contribution of reinstatement created by things such as new tasks. And this, I think, is another remarkable picture, in my opinion, because what it says is that there's very rapid automation, very rapid displacement in those 4 decades. But it is counterbalanced almost perfectly by very rapid reinstatement. So much so that the sum of the two, this thick blue line, is hovering around 0. But now fast forward to the last 30 years, and again, a sea change. Faster automation, slower reinstatement, and as a result, the sum of the two is heading south, explaining much of that slowdown in labor demand that I showed you in the first slide. But this is abstract. This brings together many different sectors, many different types of technologies. There's a lot of, there are many assumptions in order to derive these numbers. So let me zero in on a specific automation technology, industrial robots. Industrial robots have been at the heart of industrial growth in much of the Western world. In the US, for example, they have saved many industries and are among the most productive technologies. So if the view of the classic view, neoclassical view, that if you have technologies that increase productivity, that should translate almost automatically to higher labor demand, higher wages, then we should see that places that have adopted more robots should also generate more employment or higher wage growth or higher wage bill. So this is a question that Pasquale Restrepo and I investigate in paper we wrote a couple of years ago. And what we find by looking across 722 local labor markets in the United States is that exactly the opposite happens. Contrary to the sort of the view that technology will bring goodies to labor, and very consistent with the displacement view that I have articulated implicitly already, the places actually happens to be in the industrial heartland of the United States that have adopted the most robots have had the worst employment and the worst wage performance. I'm not showing you the wage. But it's not just the industrial heartland. So if you cut out these observations and you look at this cloud, it's exactly the same slope. So the more robots you've adopted, the more jobs get eliminated, the worse are the wage growth implication, the worse are the employment growth implications. Now, at this point, you might say, well, robots are old news. The future is going to be AI, and AI could be very different. It should be very different, in fact, because robots from the beginning were designed as automation technologies, whereas AI, well, it's a broad technological platform that can be used with many applications. Perhaps we can use AI to create new jobs, new tasks, new capabilities that are going to increase both productivity and jobs. But in practice, unfortunately, that's not the case. AI adoption has been driven exactly by a desire to automate, and its implications are very similar to robots displacement. So this is something in from a recent paper by myself, David Otter, Pascual Restrepo, and Joe Hazel. So we look at the near universe of establishments in the United States and classify them on the basis of their task structure, those that have more tasks that can be automated by AI. The green, the fourth quartile of that distribution, and the third quartile are the ones that have relatively more tasks that can be automated. The yellow and the black, not so much. And if you look at where AI has spread, it's exactly those that have tasks to be automated. So that already tells you that there's a lot of automation going on with AI, even though the technology is in its infancy. And if you look at what happens to hiring by those establishments, the blue and the green that have adopted all these AI technologies are not increasing their hiring much, and the black and the yellow are increasing it much more. So it looks like I'm showing it to you at the very high level of aggregation. You can do this at the sort of a micro level, and you find exactly the same thing. And regardless of how you classify tasks into those that can be automated, AI appears to have so far focused on algorithmic automation of relatively simple tasks. So why all this automation? Why so much automation? Why are we using AI for just automation? Why are we seeing much more automation than other types of technologies? I think it's important to understand the reasons before we talk about solutions. And I think one important reason is that if you look at the history of automation in the US, it starts becoming into focus when Japanese exports or imports from Japan surged and businesses really got worried, and they decided they had to cut costs in order to compete against Japanese companies. And for them to cut costs meant cut labor costs, and automation was a godsend to them. And that trend gets multiplied and strengthened after the surge in imports from China. But even more importantly, I think today, the future of technologies, digital technologies, and the future of AI is very much shaped by a handful of companies: Google, Microsoft, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, and so on. These technologies spend about $1 out of every $3 spent on AI in the United States today. But even more importantly, their business model shapes the direction of digital technologies. They prepare automation technologies for other companies. They provide software, data, and other services to other companies. And it turns out that these companies have a business model that is completely centered on automation. And as their business model becomes more and more successful, they are pushing the rest of the US economy towards automation. But it's not just global competition and market dynamics. Also, the government has been complicit in this. And one aspect of it, I'm not going to have time to talk about the institutions. I'll come back to that in a second. But let me talk about the tax code. One aspect is that, the tax code has been changing over the last 20 years in the US, more and more in a direction that encourages automation. And the easiest way of seeing that, let's look at, this is from a paper I have with Andrea Manera and Pascual Restrepo. We estimate the average marginal tax rate on labor, it's about 25%. But if you look at the average marginal tax rate on software and equipment capital, it is today now less than 5%, coming down from levels close to 20 or so. So there has been a huge tax cut on capital, creating a 20 percentage point wedge, which implies that if companies adopt automation technologies and lay off workers, and if they don't even change their production level, they're increasing their profits by 20% because of this artificial tax advantage that machines have over people. This, together with the other ones, is a powerful motive for automation. In fact, what I'm going to call excessive automation. But at this point, you might say, well, certainly I've heard many people from Silicon Valley say, well, but you don't understand. These technologies are really central for our prosperity. They're bringing all sorts of great things for us: productivity growth, transformation of the economy, perhaps even more and more abundance. Well, perhaps. There are measures you can look at that might suggest that. There are many new widgets introduced every day. The number of patents in the United States has quadrupled since 1980, mostly driven by electronics and software. Indeed, there is a lot of innovation going on in this country and in Europe and in China and in Canada and in Australia. But we don't see the fruits of it. So this is total factor productivity growth, the best measure that economists have for judging the aggregate health of the economy. And today we are going through one of the slowest periods of total factor productivity growth. So if automation is bringing all these amazing benefits, we're not seeing them in the data. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is, I would say, that we are not using these technologies in the right way. We are not making the best use of the knowledge that we have accumulated and the technological capabilities that are presented to us by digital technologies. And I'm going to expand on this point in a second, especially when trying to formulate solutions. But before I do that, let me also say that this is not just a developing world problem. In fact, the implications of these changes may be even more severe for the developing world. And the reason for that is that automation, AI-based or robotics-based automation, is in fact the quintessential case of what economists in the 1970s used to call inappropriate technology. Technology that is inappropriate for the conditions of the developing world, because the developing world is rich in human resources, but these technologies are trying to replace humans, sideline humans, by using capital, software knowledge, and very skilled work labor, all three of them being very scarce in the developing world. So in fact, exactly like you would expect from inappropriate technologies, they are going to contribute to an opening of the gap between the North and the South, and greater inequality within the developing world as well. The COVID crisis is accelerating these trends. Companies in the United States, for which I have seen some data, all say they're going to do more automation or have already done so. But, and here, transitioning towards some of the important ideas I'm going to come and collect at the end, the future does not need to be fully automated. Digital technology and AI can be used in creating human-friendly technologies. We can have episodes such as the 4 decades after World War II, where automation is ongoing, but it is counterbalanced by other possibilities, other opportunities for workers. And this ensures both more rapid productivity growth and a more shared form of technology. And in contrast to, again, what you might hear from Silicon Valley and some of their channelers in the academic world, the direction of technology is not preordained. It's not like there is a particular path of AI that we all have to follow, and that's the one that Google and DeepMind and all of these trillion-dollar companies are sort of following. But the direction of technology is a choice. Companies, society, via government policies, are making choices And there is no guarantee, as I'm going to talk about in a second, that these choices are the optimal ones. And if technology is so important for prosperity, for inequality, for creating opportunities for labor, then we have to think about what is the optimal balance of technology? All automation, or automation and something that counterbalances it? And if the market's not going to deliver it, we have to think about regulation of technology. And again, that might sound like something almost sacrilege. We as policymakers or academics suggesting that there should be regulation of technology rather than the market deciding it. But yes, indeed, I think there is no theorem in economics that says innovation's direction is optimal. Innovation is one of those activities that generates most externalities, most disruptive effects. You know, even if you're a big believer in the first welfare theorem, it just doesn't apply to innovation. Sometimes markets deliver the right mix of innovation, but there is no guarantee, and especially when the market is dominated by big tech and managers that are so worried about delivering profits that they think they have to cut costs immediately. Well, that creates a mix of incentives that actually pushes too much towards automation. But I can definitely see there will be some in the audience that are unconvinced. How could we call as economists for a framework for robust regulation of technology? Well, my next point is actually amplifying this. Inequality is not the only existential challenge facing us. Perhaps even more important is climate change. Perhaps the market and businesses are working hard to solve the climate crisis. Indeed, there have been big advances, but when you look into the details, it's not thanks to large companies. And in fact, I'm going to argue they have been impediments on the way. The most important advances have been in basic green technologies, renewables, solar and wind. And here is some data from IRENA. If you look in 2000s, as late as late 2000s, the cost of solar was high, very, very high, non-competitive with fossil fuels. Wind was also very high in the late 1990s. But there is a tremendous growth in the productivity of these technologies, and today, actually, they are competitive with fossil fuel. And I dare say that if we remove the close to $5 trillion subsidies that the fossil fuel is receiving around the world today, they are actually much more effective than fossil fuel, except in a few heavy fuel tasks, such as airplanes and trucks. This was achieved by innovation, but not by big tech. It was achieved by innovation at a much more decentralized level. And you can see that, for example, in the US data. I'll show you in other countries as well. These are different measures of renewables and green patents relative to either total patents or fossil fuel patents. And in all cases, you see, starting from 2000, you see a huge increase in the number of green patents. How did this come about? Mostly new companies, small companies, and a lot of regulation. California and major state regulations on clean energy standards, and some subsidies from the federal government. And quite importantly, and I'll come back to this topic as well in my conclusion, pressure from consumers that wanted cleaner products, electric cars, and pressure from employees that didn't want their employer to have a heavy carbon footprint. But the good story, the good feel-good account stops around 2010. A very sharp decline since 2011. This is again not a US phenomenon. A very similar pattern in Canada, France, Germany. What's going on? Well, what's going on is actually big oil comes into the picture. With shale gas and other gas discoveries that have become part of the energy supply, coal's importance has been declining, replaced by gas, which is slightly cleaner than coal, but still emits a lot of fossil fuel. But most importantly, it's been reducing the price of energy. And it's made some of the investments in green technologies less profitable. So here is time series evidence. I'm not going to go into the microdata, but you can provide some more bolstering evidence for this. So this is the green to fossil fuel patents that I showed you, the blue one, and the red one is the natural gas price index. So when the natural gas prices start falling and flooding the market, that's exactly when there is the reversal in green technologies and green patents. So this is whatever ExxonMobil and Chevron are saying about their commitment to a clean climate, a clean technology and saving climate. This is, shale gas and big oil's effect. But these are not the only major challenges. If we want to make sure that we get the good side of automation, not the bad, if we want to avoid excessive automation impoverishing billions, if we want to deal with huge inequalities, if we want to make sure that big companies do not stymie the efforts to combat climate change, I think they'll have the most potent weapon for us is the democratic process. Society's participation, as I said, people protesting, people putting pressure on companies for cleaner products, on their employers to clean up their act. And that is part of the broader democratic process. And of course, there are many other aspects of our modern civilization and life that heavily depends on these democratic institutions. But unfortunately, democracy is in danger too. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was euphoria about the future of democracy, some going as far as political scientist Francis Fukuyama declaring the end of history. Samuel Huntington, actually Fukuyama's advisor, was talking about the third wave of democracy spreading around the world. And indeed, in the 1990s and early 2000s, we did experience a large number of countries becoming democratic. But since 2005, every year, according to the Freedom House and other organizations, we've had more countries move away from democracy to dictatorship or weaken the quality of their democratic institutions. So democracy is under threat as well. But it's even worse than that. Trust in public institutions is in the wane, and especially in democratic countries. So China and Singapore have much higher trust in public institutions, and even Turkey, which has become a quasi-dictatorship over the last 15 years, than most democratic countries. So what's going on is that a variety of technological effects, both because of inequality and the inability of the democratic governments to deliver on shared prosperity, and also digital technologies' effects on social communication, political discourse, and monitoring by governments, we have provided many more tools to the hands of both dictators and authoritarian right-wing populists such as Trump, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and so on. And to make matters worse, as a background factor, perhaps you can include this as a fourth existential challenge, but I think it's more of as the plumbing of the other challenges going wrong. We also have the unraveling of the global world order, because many of these challenges, from climate change to automation and AI technologies, are global. Australia cannot redirect technological change in AI. Neither can Germany. It's decided in Silicon Valley, it's decided in China, it's decided in Europe. And we also have globalization process itself going through very tough times at the moment, partly because of these difficult processes. So I think we have to think of democracies' current difficulties in the same broad framework as automation and digital technologies. And why nations fail, James Robinson and I define inclusive institutions as those that create incentives and opportunities for a broad cross-section of people. Throughout history, the main barrier to inclusivity has been the excessive power of elites, often via coercion and control of key assets. But I think we are entering an age of a different type of threat to inclusivity. It is through automation and control of data. And the reason I say that is because throughout the ages, again, the labor market has been the nexus of where you create where you create inclusivity. Shared prosperity starts from the labor market. Workers have wage gains, find meaningful jobs. And what we are doing is, with control of data, monitoring, and automation, we are creating all these good jobs. Either the jobs are being eliminated, or they are becoming much lower wage or low wage growth jobs because of changes in how jobs are and how production is organized. And on top of it, I think some of the other challenges to democracy that work by strengthening corporations and governments against citizens and abetting polarization and misinformation are also technological in nature. So therefore, I come back, and now to the conclusion, I come back to my main thesis. As an extension of the framework that James Robinson and I suggested in Why Nations Fail, where you have to look at the co-determination of economic and political institutions, today we really have to look at the direction of technological change. And because, as we have seen over the last 30 years, there is no guarantee that those technology choices are going to create jobs, are going to create shared prosperity, are going to deal with climate change, are going to internalize the pollution implications, or are going to take into account the damage that they're doing to democracy, we really have to think about regulation of technology. But who's going to do that regulation of technology? Can we trust the Chinese government? No, because they actually are the ones who benefit from the monopoly of data to set up a dictatorship of the Communist Party over people. Can we trust the American government? Well, not really, not that much either. You know, NSA is as guilty in manipulating data and snooping and excessive surveillance as the Chinese Communist Party. Can we trust Google? Well, certainly not. They are even worse offenders when it comes to control of data and violations of privacy. So then, I think we have a conundrum. How can we achieve this regulation of technology? Well, let me end with 2 slides that really puts that into perspective, and then I'll welcome your comments and questions. So essentially, in some sense, what I'm calling for is a new welfare state. Let's call it welfare state 3.0. It is one that is 3.0 as opposed to the 1.0 or 2.0, because it will have to be more efficient, more effective, but also it will have new responsibilities. In particular, combating inequality, climate change, pandemics. I didn't talk about pandemics because time is short, but obviously it's at the back of most people's mind. And most importantly, very new regulation of technology, much more holistic approach to regulation of technology. This was exactly the kind of vision, or what I'm trying to articulate, exactly the kind of vision that led to the birth of welfare state 1.0. One important element there, although Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Norway, had tried it in the 1930s and quite successfully so, I might add. But a defining document was Beveridge, Lord William Beveridge's report, which came out in the middle of the war in 1942. And many people actually credit it by re-energizing the British public to fight more vigorously, because the provisions of the Beveridge report started being implemented. It was a blueprint for a welfare state. And of course, the workforce of the UK welcomed it with open arms. But not everybody was happy. This gentleman, one of the most important social scientists of the 20th century, as you will know, Friedrich von Hayek, then a recent emigre teaching in my alma mater, the London School of Economics, was incensed. He read the Beveridge's report and immediately fired a memo to Beveridge, and then turned it into an essay and turned it into one of the most important social science books of the 20th century, The Road to Serfdom. In it, Hayek argued, well, you might have noble aspirations, but what you're doing is, by strengthening the state, you are destroying liberty. Because once the state becomes so powerful, this is exactly what you have to fear. At the end, however, Hayek turned out to be wrong. Welfare state institutions were adopted pretty much everywhere in the Western world, and they bolstered that shared prosperity that I showed in the 4 decades following World War II. And there was no extinguishing of liberty, collapse of democratic institutions, or any type of second serfdom or new totalitarianism. Why not? Well, time is short, but in 1 minute, this is partly what the more recent book that I have with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, addresses. We provide a theory of evolution of state institutions in conjunction with state-society relations. And an extremely simple version of it is in this figure. You have to think about both the power of society to organize, have its voices heard, for example, via democratic means, but sometimes non-democratic means, and the power capacity of the states and the elites that control it. And we argue, and I think in some sense Hayek would have agreed with us, liberty, democracy, inclusive growth exists in this area here, which looks like a narrow corridor, when there is balance between state and society. And in this conceptualization, then Hayek's concern is that, well, you are in that corridor, but you strengthen the state and you come out of it and you spin into a Chinese direction, a despotic direction. But actually it turned out that Hayek was wrong, because that's not the only possibility. Another possibility, what we call the Red Queen effect, like in Alice in Wonderland, when the state runs faster and takes on more responsibilities and more power, society, democratic institutions may run faster in return. And in particular, that's exactly what happened. Democracy deepened, political participation broadened, and the West and many non-Western countries developed institutional and social means of keeping elites, politicians, and inequality under check. Social inequality, status inequality, dominance of firms and powerful individuals were all kept under check by democratic institutions. But since then, technology has changed. Large companies have become much stronger. The world looks very different than it did in the 60s and the 70s. And the question is, can we build new institutions, which this is what I put under the rubric of welfare state 3.0, and can we prove Hayek wrong again? And I think it is an imperative that we try. Thank you very much. And again, sorry for the delay, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Well, Daron, thank you very much indeed. I don't know if I speak for other members of the audience, but I certainly feel as I've been drinking from a fire hose from the last 40 minutes. There's such a wide canvas of issues that you've raised, all of which are essential and important, and you've integrated them in such an inspiring way, if I may say so. Now, we have a number of questions that have come forward, but our tradition in the Charles Goode Oration, as you might imagine, is to give the first opportunity to Mr. Goode. And Charles has submitted a question which I'm very keen here to read to you. I think it comes off this last point that you've been making, Daron, about the concerns about the cure being worse or at least as bad as the disease. In other words, the concerns about government regulation that you put forward, what the issues are that surround that as well. So let me read Charles's question, and it may invite you to expand a little further on that. Charles asks, the suggestion you have to help society fix its problems caused by technology include increased government intervention through regulation, which of course creates its own set of problems. What are some of the risks that you foresee around this, and how would you get the balance right between competition and the, if you like, appropriate technological innovation and government regulation and its downsides?
That's Daron. A great question. And I think it's exactly the crux of the matter. And I think we can say some broad general points, but the devil's in the detail. And, you know, I think there are two kinds of costs of government regulation. The first is inefficiency. Some mistakes are going to be made. Government bureaucrats may not get it. So if you say that, you know, government bureaucrats should have a say on the direction of technological change, people will throw you out of the window in Silicon Valley because they think that they are the smart ones and the government bureaucrats are dumb. Well, there is some truth to that. Why? Because the government has downsized so much in the United States that it no longer hires talent. You know, in the 1940s and 50s, John von Neumann worked for the government. And, you know, we don't have the current John von Neumann's work, but even John von Neumann would make mistakes. So, you know, we have to sort of take those inefficiencies into account. But I think if they are just inefficiencies and some wrong projects get funded and some marginal projects get less funding from the government, and then somebody can pursue them on their own, that's not a big deal. But I think the bigger deal is exactly what Hayek was worried about. When we empower the government, what is there to stop the politicians or the powerful actors and blocking technologies that are actually good for progress? And I think that's where vigilance is very important. It's a 24-hour business, 24/7.
Indeed. Just coming now to the questions that have been submitted by our audience. The first one, the one that's received most upvotes from my colleague Vivek Chowdhury, who thanks you also for an outstanding lecture, comes to that point. In this country, you may be aware, Daron, our competition regulator actually took on Facebook and one or two of the others, and that was, a bit of a struggle. But we did actually win a round or two. Mind you, as a small sort of middling-sized country with a government that's not as influential perhaps as it likes to think it is, we find ourselves dealing with some of these titans. And so the question comes to, I guess, a variation of what you've just been addressing. How do you deal with global titans when you're a small country imposing regulations? You have sovereignty over your own country, that's true, but that may be nothing compared with the power of the global titans, who can threaten, as they did in this instance, to basically pull the plug on you, right? Yeah. Cut you off, and then expose you to the wrath of your own younger generations. How do you deal with that?
Wonderful question. Thank you, Vivek. And let me say two things. First of all, I think, yes, indeed, I was going to mention that, but I ran out of time. Australia has a fantastic record in terms of dealing with tech companies, and not such an admirable record in terms of dealing with climate change. So but both of them come down to the same thing. Sometimes, countries by themselves can do miracles, but often that's difficult. We live in a globalized world. And that globalized world has now formed as a bipolar world between China and the US. But neither China nor the US is the right leader for taking us in this direction that I'm outlining. Climate change, I think they're among the worst two offenders. Data control, monopoly, manipulation of data, automation, again, among the worst offenders. So what we need is another pole, or perhaps another two poles. European Union, I think, has tried to do that, but also Australia needs to work with other countries. Because if, it's not just Australia, but it's Australia, Brazil, India that worries about AI's effects, that's much more powerful. And I think it's really the whole developing world that needs to worry about some of the effects of Facebook. Myanmar is one of the places that suffered some of the worst influences, Philippines, Brazil with the WhatsApp. So I think the effects of misinformation and manipulation through some of these platforms, and the effects of AI and automation on the livelihood of billions of people in the developing world, I think those are things that should bring the many countries together.
Indeed, one of the common serial questions is to whether the developing world be condemned to be forever developing as a result of the trends that you've just been indicating. I'd like to go to a question from Catherine Brown, who represents one of our significant donors to the school, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund. Catherine, thank you for joining us today. Catherine was taken by your emphasis on the role of small companies, particularly in developing responses to the climate challenge. And she wonders about how we can get more good stories into financial and mainstream media about the role of small, innovative organizations in leading that charge. And that in a sense, when the bigger ones, particularly as you point out, driven by AI or other technological developments, start to scale up and take over, that the innovation and the challenge begins to be, resiled from. How do we actually give more oxygen to the smaller, innovative companies over against their powerful rivals?
That's, I think, a great question. And let me amplify that. I think the problem isn't just that small companies are more creative. They are. But I think they have two advantages in regards to the sort of issues I'm talking about. First of all, they don't have all of that profit that they're making from either fossil fuels, in the case of big oil, or existing monopolies of data and automation technologies, as in the case of big tech. So the RO's replacement effect says they are going to be the ones who are going to take the plunge and come up with new ways. But second, the political aspect, lobbying. Small companies don't lobby, big ones do. Big ones put their energy to lobbying rather than innovation when it comes to protecting their rents. And you see a huge amount on lobbying. While, ExxonMobil, while it puts millions of ads about how they are committed to a green future, they're also spending millions of dollars to convince American delegates not to be too aggressive on COP26. So all of those means that we need small companies. And I think financing of small companies is one area. I think we need to encourage financing of small companies. If you look at the US banking system, a huge amount of money goes to fossil fuels. Again, mostly big players. But exactly like you said, we also need to tell the story to the wider public of the role that small companies can play, and also prepare the institutional framework for their flourishing. And antitrust is an important element here. I don't think antitrust is the full solution to the problems we're dealing with, but obviously it has to be one of the pillars that, right now it's impossible for companies to compete against Google or Microsoft or Facebook, and that is an antitrust problem.
Thanks, Daron. We're going to take one last question. We are a little over the original time, but we had a late start, and there's obviously such interest in what you've been speaking about, Daron. I'll take a question from Grace Chandra, who asks about the role of the multilateral or international institutions that you mentioned. Specifically, she lists, of course, the IMF, World Bank, and United Nations, and so forth. And she just wonders here, I think I'm interpreting her question correctly, how much faith we can place in those institutions when they are in fact dominated by some of the powerful sources of, or anti-democratic structures like China and Russia, or heavily influenced by the big capital, as arguably the United States might be in such forums. What can be done to achieve greater global transparency and accountability of those global institutions themselves?
Well, thank you, Grace. I think that's a fantastic question. And again, because time was short, I did not say too much about the unraveling of the global order. And obviously, global cooperation is key. And I don't think you can have global cooperation on an ad hoc basis. So you need institutions. And we should build new institutions, but we should also work with the institutions that we have, such as UN, IMF, and World Bank. But a major problem is that those institutions are compromised. So I think WHO, for example, which is an institution I admire a lot, but was definitely compromised by Chinese lobbying and influence at the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think public pressure and new visions really matter. And let me give you an example from the IMF. So if you look at the IMF's policies, recommendations, and the way of thinking, throughout the 60s, 70s, especially 80s, it was indeed, as you said, Ian, a tool of big capital. It was really a tool of American capital imposing austerity and reforms on developing countries, economies, that were good for one reading and one sort of conceptualization of global trade and global integration, but often very costly for their public. But then, sometime around 2000, a transformation started. And today, IMF is actually much more independent from, I think, American interests than it was in the past. And it is also, not completely. That would require more institutional reforms by, having more independent bodies, more independent supervisory bodies. But for example, during the global financial crisis, and especially in its aftermath, the European debt crisis and the Greek crisis, the IMF was much more radical and much more on point in terms of what needed to be done than European Union and German banks and French banks, for example, calling for less austerity in Greece and restructuring or forgiveness of debts. And also on inflation, it's been much less orthodox than, for example, most central banks, and saying, the economy needs to get going during the crisis and more monetary laxness is acceptable. So that shows that, with new ideas, new public pressure, new changes in priorities, some of these institutions can be made to work, but they will always remain vulnerable to takeover by China, Russia, the US. And I think my only feasible solution to that is, again, creating another pole. So if there is better coordination among other countries and pushing in their own direction, not in their selfish direction, not Australians wanting more Australians in IMF, but actually wanting IMF to work for the broader community of economies, I think that could be effective.
That's terrific. Daron, we're up against time, unfortunately, and I can see there's still a stack of questions that your address has stimulated in people's minds, which is wonderful. That's the whole purpose of the oration, and we're very, very grateful to you for that. I'm also looking forward to the fact that you'll be speaking to my colleagues in a staff seminar as well about some of your ideas, which is another way for us to get access to all of your thinking. I do point out, of course, that Daron mentioned 2 of his books at least, and he's probably too modest to say so, but I'm not. I'm very much looking forward to going and getting a copy of one or both of those books and reading further in greater depth about Daron's thinking in these important areas. So Daron, on our collective behalf, let me thank you once again for sharing your views and provoking our thinking this morning in such a professional way, and frankly, in such a mind-expanding way. It's really excellent address. Thank you. And to you, Charles, thank you for your continued commitment to enabling the school to bring global thought leaders of Daron's caliber to the school. I know that's your vision with the Charles Goode Oration, and we try each year to do that. Well, this year we've succeeded enormously, as you no doubt would agree. It's very, very important. We wish, Daron, that you'd be here in person. That's the whole purpose. I know Charles will be on my case about that. You need to be here in person so that we can have more to learn from you in person. But anyway, given the circumstances, particularly given the unwellness in your family, that we've been able to see you online is just terrific. And ladies and gentlemen, finally, thank you to you, our audience, for being with us, for attending today's address. It's terrific that you've been able to be with us. In the coming days, you'll expect to receive an email with a link to a survey. We'd love to have your feedback on this morning's event. And that email will also include a link to a recording. Daron has agreed to this address to be recorded. Should you wish to read it again, listen to it again, I should say, or have a look at some of the questions that have been put forward by other members of the audience. So with that, let me thank everyone for attendance. Again, Daron, thank you. Thank you to our special guests for joining us this morning. And let me wish everyone a very good morning, at least on this side of the international dateline. Good morning.